So trying to work on getting audio to transfer over.
Maybe
So
use
they
the
can,
phone interface.
yeah. So you can probably hear me because we're still on Hangouts, but I'm having an issue sharing your audio. So stand by.
Please bear with us a second, folks. We are working on a technical issue with the audio at this time. We'll be starting here shortly, just as soon as we get that straightened out.
Test. 1, 2, 3.
All right, there's our audio. Fantastic. Great to have you here. All right, folks. We are about to start with Morgan, also known as Synaptic Rewrite, on reverse engineering and indoor gardening 101. We have a quick introductory overview of reverse engineering, including the difference between debuggers, disassemblers, and decompilers, and a discussion of the general workflow and specialties and sub-niches that span the hardware-software spectrum. For gardening, the discussion will include both soil and hydroponic-based gardens, to include an instructional discussion of setting up and caring for both retail and homemade systems. Should time permit, there may be a brief show and tell of several indoor hydroponic-based systems containing several types of herbs, cherry tomato, and pepper plants. And let me tell you, I'm looking forward to that part. So we have here Morgan with Reverse Engineering and Indoor Gardening 101. Over to you.
Hello. Hi, I'm Morgan. This is my talk, Reverse Engineering 101 in 20 minutes. I apologize if I go a little bit fast. This talk is intended to be a very, very baseline. You've never seen reverse engineering before, you've only heard the term, that type of thing, and you're trying to figure out what exactly it is and how it works. This is not a talk that will teach you completely how to do it, because that is not possible in 20 minutes. So let's get started. So who even am I? This is who I am, the kind of thing, my current stuff, my education, a little bit about my background. Not going to go into too terrible much detail here because I'm here to talk about reverse engineering, not me. So, quick overview. We're going to be talking about human code versus machine code, the different layers of abstraction, so going from hardware to more digital, more conceptual things like programs, instructions, things like that. And that'll let us be able to give a better definition of what exactly reverse engineering is. At that point, we'll be able to talk about static versus dynamic approaches to reverse engineering and some of the tools involved there, such as IDA versus Ghidra. And we'll briefly cover some of the niches and specialties. One moment. Okay, so who speaks what when it comes to computers? In computers, binary is the mother tongue of machinery. Number systems consist of literally ones and zeros. When a computer carries out an instruction, it doesn't see what we see. It operates entirely 1 versus 0. More on that later. Now, binary can also be represented as hexadecimal, also known as, frequently called just hex. That's a base 16 number system that goes 0 through 9 like you're used to, but then also A, B, C, D, E, F. It's easier to read than binary. It's useful for quickly looking at specific characters or opcodes. A lot of times you'll see it as two different numbers, a 2-digit hexadecimal number basically. So you might have like 1F or FF or even 12. 10 is actually not binary and is actually not 10 in binary. Can you guys still hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, excellent. So hexadecimal, when you put it together, it can be translated into mnemonics. So that's what assembly is. Hexadecimal is still technically talking machine code, but it's a little easier for humans to see, but it still doesn't mean anything to us. So if you see an instruction that's like MOV, move, that's a mnemonic that's easier for a human to understand. So the lowest level human readable programming language is assembly. That's what gives a processor specific instructions step by step. However, because there are different kinds of processor, there can be different kinds of assembly language. So language levels. You have machine code, which is the binary like I was talking about there. That's kind of what it looks like. You get your bits and your bytes, and it's just a string of ones and zeros that's calculated using a base 2 binary numbering system. Now, binary can be represented as hex, which is what you see there next, hello world, in the 2-digit hexadecimal numbers. This leads us to our lower level assembly languages, which end up looking like this. x86 computers, ARM tends to be more embedded devices, phones, Arduinos, all of that kind of thing. Now you'll notice on these small little clips here that there's different colors on these. Those correspond to the instructions in the high-level language down there. So there's a little piece of source code in C at the bottom there where include sdio.h, int main, all of that. That's the human readable higher level language. That's in C code. Now the green int main there corresponds to the green push move on the x86 one, or the push add on the ARM one. This is from a nifty little tool called Godbolt. It's actually an interactive online browser disassembler. More on disassemblers in a moment. So moving from physical to abstract, we have our memory. We have memory, the RAM. So RAM contains a bunch of matrices. It's got rows and columns, and each one of those has a little cell. Each cell can have a positive or negative charge. That's where binary comes from as far as the computer is concerned. That's the ones and the zeros. So the processor reads all the plus and minus cells like a map or an instruction booklet. So the ones and zeros are data, they're instructions. This is all still on the physical layer. This is something physically measurable, something you can actually not see with the naked eye, but you could see it with the appropriate kind of microscope or instrumentation. So these data or instructions, represented as charge maps, so to speak, can be represented in hexadecimal. That's when we start getting into the more logical, the more abstract view of things. So this hexadecimal can be translated into assembly language. We have now reached the point to where you can't see assembly language on charge necessarily, at least not in a human readable format, but you can see the representation of it, mnemonics, inside a disassembler. So assembly is the compiled result of human readable code. So you write hello world in your IDE or in a text document or whatever, you hand it over to the compiler, and then the compiler turns it into assembly language that can go back down the chain. So how are programs made exactly? Because if we don't know how they're made, we're not going to know how to take them and take them apart. So human writes something in a high-level language like C or C++, like I said. Compiler takes that code, makes it machine readable, and spits out the end result. This is where you get your .exes, your .bins, DLLs, things like that. The nice little pre-packaged programs that you use on a computer without having to build it yourself. That is compiled code. So that's what the computer takes, because it's just as far as the computer is concerned, it's just a clump of instructions and data. So human readable code to compiler assembly, which spits out machine code. So what is reverse engineering? Reverse engineering, moving backwards, is taking machine code and tearing it apart in something called a disassembler. It takes your exe, your binary, etc., and it tears it apart, and then the program will do some of this, but a lot of it becomes manual thing that has to be done by a human to try and take that disassembly and make it into something that we actually, well, not necessarily make it, but shift it into something we understand better. Try to figure out how it works, what the functionality is. If you're trying to change something, if you're trying to fix something, if you're just trying to investigate something, you try to put it back into ways that you understand. Decompilation is when you take the code and turn it back into human readable, but we'll go over that again in a moment. So basically, RE is trying to figure out how something works in human terms by taking that pre-made compiled binary and tearing it apart. There are two basic forms of RE, dynamic analysis and static analysis. Dynamic analysis is sort of like a vivisection. You take a file, you run it, you actively make it happen. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be a file, but it's most commonly going to be. Most instances you hear of RE, that's what's going on. So you basically take it, you run it, and then you try to see what it does. This can be done a couple different ways. You can detonate it in a sandbox, or what's known as a virtual machine. So you take it, you sort of section it off in its own little section of the computer where it's not going to affect your operating system, it's not going to break things. This is especially important if you're say, analyzing a piece of malware. You run it, you observe the behavior. You can use a bunch of different tools depending on your operating system. This will differ. There are lots of lists of information out there about that. But you're essentially seeing, all right, if I just run this, what happens? You could also do this on a separate physical machine if you had one that you were willing to be a victim computer, but do not just run a random file on your computer without having some sort of isolation from the rest of the system. Debuggers are another very popular, very common way of dynamically analyzing things. And generally when you say dynamic analysis, this is what most people are going to think of. This is where you take a file and you run it. So you attach to the process. So when you run notepad.exe, there's a process that runs that notepad is. You can attach the debugger to that process, which allows you to do things like insert breakpoints. A breakpoint basically just says, all right, debugger, run the file until you get to this instruction or this spot in memory, and then stop. Not stop as in close the program, stop as in pause. This allows you to see what is in memory at that time period, which allows you to look at things such as registers. It can be risky if you're not careful because there are still ways for things to get around. You could also have memory leaks, other things that could affect your system. Sometimes this is nifty to do in a sandbox as well. However, that often will cause compatibility issues, or you won't be able to fully run it because of system requirements. WinDBG is probably one of the most popular, common, famous tools for debuggers. Immunity is another common one, and OllyDBG is kind of old, but it's used in a lot of RE 101 type instructions. So if you hear that one, that's what it is. It's a debugger. So static analysis. This is what most people think of when they think pure software reverse engineering. You take a file and you take it apart without running it. It's a dissection instead of a vivisection. So a disassembler takes the binary and it gives you assembly. So you might drop an exe into a tools such as IDAPRO or Ghidra or Binary Ninja, things like that. You drop the binary into it, and it looks through the machine code and creates what it thinks is the assembly there. So this will differ based on the different kind of processor or machine that it thinks you're running it on, or that it thinks that it was compiled for, and give you the appropriate assembly language for it, showing you the different instructions and loops. A decompiler is slightly different. They're often included with disassemblers, but they are not exactly the same thing. In this case, you'll put in the binary and you'll get what the decompiler thinks is the higher level code. So you might drop in Notepad.exe and it will tell you what it thinks the C code looks like. Now that sounds great and amazing, except that decompilers are not perfect and they often are wrong. They won't always get it right, which is why disassemblers tend to be more common, because that's a much more one-to-one ratio between the instructions that the binary has and the instructions that the machine's actually being told to carry out. So Ghidra Ghidra was a tool created by the NSA it's actually a framework for reverse engineering. Recently, in the past year or so, it became open source. So you can actually go and you can download it for free. You can play with it. Installing it can be a little bit tricky, but there are guides for it. It actually comes with its own documentation. It comes with its own training and classes. And it's got a lot going on. One advantage that it has, other than being free over IDAPRO, is that it actually comes with its own decompiler out the box. So on the side here, on the left screenshot, you'll notice towards the right side, basically right under the RA and Ghidra, the little window says decompiler main. This is the code that it thinks. That's what it thinks the C code looks like. Now in this case, it's just a hello world, so that's pretty easy to take apart, and that is accurate in this instance. On the left side, in the main window there, you see a bunch of instructions: push, move, leave. That's more of that assembly that I was discussing. On the right side, underneath the Ghidra Dragon logo, that's the graph view. Right now, it's pretty simple because this is just a hello world, and more complex ones, it starts having loops where you'll see that box, but you'll also see another one below it, and it'll be linked. You might see a line going back to the previous box where it goes a loop. This is the most basic example. So IDAPRO used to be the main tool on the market for disassembly, and by many people is still considered the gold standard, although Ghidra has been catching up. there is a free version that you can download, and it's pretty good. However, a lot of its most powerful functionality is locked behind a pretty hefty paywall. So a lot of people never get to use IDAPRO unless it's been paid for by their employer. That being said, it's been around for a little bit longer, and it's had a lot more commercial support. It's had a lot more people who've poked at it because it's been more accessible to the public, even if it's been behind that paywall. So a lot of classic reverse engineering tutorials and instructions and all that kind of thing will use IDA, and that'll be its main instruction. Occasionally, you'll see ones that use other things, such as Binary Ninja or Radar2. Pronunciation differs. But these two tools are the main two that you usually see when it comes to reverse engineering. So, RE subfields by layer, because reverse engineering, what I've mostly been discussing now is mostly on the software side, which is what most people think of when it comes to reverse engineering. Now, a lot of this also very much covers and encompasses firmware. Firmware is essentially the software that interfaces with the hardware layer. There is such a thing as hardware RE as well. So these are some general lenience, but not hard definitions, because no one really firmly agrees, pun not intended, on what exactly firmware is. Some people think that it's the driver, some people think it's the bootloader, some people think it's the information in read-only memory, things like that. That gets to be really very fuzzy. Even on the hardware side, some people still view that as software. So when people say that, oh, they do software RE or firmware RE or hardware RE, these are the kinds of things that I generally tend to see them specializing in my personal experience. Some people will probably agree with me, and they will probably have completely valid points, but the whole point here is that they're fuzzy overlapping boundaries. No one fully agrees on it, but this is generally a really vague idea of what we're talking about when we use these different terms within RE. So another way that RE is often commonly broken out is by target. Traditional computers is a very common one. This would also encompass a lot of the web app type stuff. However, embedded devices tends to be its own sub-niche on a macro scale almost of RE targets, because someone who does RE for a phone or a vehicle may not have a great idea of how the assembly language or how the structure and processes work for traditional computer RE. Malware is also its own special type, and this can also fall into computers or embedded devices because malware can be found on either one. Usually it's looking at computers, but mobile malware has been becoming a bigger thing over time. Signals and protocols, these are sometimes grouped into RE as well, but not what most people think. RFRE is amazing, but those people are insanely smart, if not just insane. But that's reversing the actual radio signals to try and find the protocols that it's carried on and how that kind of thing works. A lot of times there's a lot of overlap with people who do just straight up network reverse engineering. So that's a general idea of how RE is broken down based off of layer and based off of target. That's the general gist of things. So if there's questions, comments on reverse engineering at this point, after this I'll be switching to the gardening talk.
We can just put all the questions at the end. There are a few of them, but
do we have any questions?
There are some questions, but we'll keep them for the end. Can you hear me?
One moment. Okay, I'm going to switch over to my camera. Hello. All right. Questions for the end. I've just been informed. All right, excellent. Well, so gardening 101. I do actually have one slide basically for this. So there's a couple different ways that you can do gardening inside. First off is to know what you can do that in soil or you can do it in water, but we'll get to that more in a moment, because first we're going to be talking about plants' needs. Plants have different kinds of needs, obviously. We all learned this in kindergarten. Plants need light, they need water, they need air, and usually you hear that they need soil, but to be more specific, they need nutrients and they need support. So for potted plants, for soil plants, you basically have your pot, which can take a bunch of different forms. Planters, they can be a plastic container, it can be a terracotta pot. They need dirt for the soil-based ones, water, light. Light can take a few different forms. If you have a sunny window, that can be useful. If you have a porch or a balcony, that can be effective if you get enough sun. However, a lot of times you're just going to have to rely on putting a light on it. Now, sometimes a nice bright white light will work depending on the spectrum. However, you can get special plant lights. You'll notice that they're sort of purple, and oftentimes there'll be LEDs that are purple and blue. I highly recommend the LEDs over the bulb style, just because of the fact that the LEDs won't get quite as hot and they're much more energy efficient, which is useful, especially if it's really close to the plant, because it's less likely that you'll burn the leaves. All right, so that discusses light. Water, generally tap water will work just fine most of the time. If you have especially hard water or you have a plant that needs a special amount of acidity or something like that, you might have to do some sort of treatment. That gets a little bit more specialized. For beginner level, tap water is fine. If you really want to get fancy, start looking into your specific plants that you're growing. So air. We all learned in kindergarten, or at least a lot of us did, that plants take in CO2, they put out oxygen. Your plants still need other trace gases in certain amounts, but that's not as important. However, it's the roots and leaves that tend to need air. So if you have really dense soil or you keep your plant wet all the time, the roots will start to rot. It'll drown, depending on the plant. Some plants really love water. Some plants really need to be dry. That's plant specific. A lot of the plants that you'll get at Home Depot or from a general gardening store that say they're indoor plants are usually fairly forgiving. But a lot of times they'll have a special potting soil, such as Miracle-Gro potting soil mix, that'll have gel beads in them or just be made of a certain mix that's much more moisture absorbent. And a lot of times it will have fertilizer built into it. Now, after a while, the soil will be depleted, or if you use soil from your yard, after a while your plants might start to turn pale or a certain color of yellow or something like that. That might mean that they need nutrients. You can pick up fertilizer mix from, again, Home Depot, Amazon, any place that sells gardening supplies, essentially. If you really, really want to start geeking out on things, you can actually start making your own plant mix if you're truly trying to optimize the quality of your plants. And then support. So the amount of support a plant requires varies wildly. 1 second. Some plants will be very tall and very spindly, and you might have to put what's called a trellis. Essentially, it's scaffolding for the plant. Vines especially tend to be like that, where they will grow and they'll wrap around things to try and climb upwards. This is what you'll usually see on a fence. In this case, the fence is the trellis. However, plants that just grow straight up, like say a dandelion or a succulent or something like that, they basically just need some soil that they can dig their roots into and stay upright. Plants that you see in the little glass balls hanging in stores, air plants, they don't really require much support at all. They tend to hang out in trees. That's also what a lot of moss and Spanish moss and things like that are. So those are the 5 basic needs for a plant: light, water, air, nutrients, support. All right, so for hydroponics, light, water, and air, they're about the same. Nutrients are a little bit different because in hydroponics, you can't have certain kinds of, you can't have ammonia because your plant's still going to need nitrogen, but the ammonia doesn't get broken down by the bacteria in the soil. So if you're using, for the layman, all this really means is if you're going to be giving a fertilizer to a plant, to a hydroponic plant, just make sure it's a hydroponic fertilizer. That's all you really have to do. That does mean that if you're using, you might not necessarily be able to use the same fertilizer that you use for a potted plant. The containers tend to be a little bit different, can be a little bit different for hydroponics. So the most basic hydroponic system in the world looks like this. This is a coffee mug with a succulent that I stuck into it. So you can see the roots that are growing out the bottom here. I moved into this apartment probably a month and a half ago. This is a large plant that I actually have outside on the balcony. This little piece had broken off, but I didn't want to lose it, so I just took it and I stuck it in water. Now, if I leave this in here eventually, I will need to add some nutrients to it. However, at the moment, it seems to be doing just fine because none of those roots, the little white hairs here are the roots, existed when I put this in the cup first. But now, after a couple weeks, it's starting to grow nicely. One of the nice things about doing this is then if I can either keep it hydroponic, or I can fill a, or I can fill a container with dirt and plant it into it. For a demo in a moment, I'm going to be showing how to transplant a oregano plant to a larger container. So taking something smaller, because plants, there's technically one more need. They need space. Some plants will be most definitively sized. They only grow to a certain size. They don't get any bigger. Some will continually grow and grow and grow throughout their lifetime. But generally, a lot of times you start with a smaller plant, it gets bigger over time. So this means at some point you have to repot a plant. All right, just checking time. So a couple different ways of getting said plants. 1, you can buy a plant at the store. 2, you can grow a plant from seed. You can order seeds online, you can pick them up from the store. They will come in many different sizes and shapes. So for example, here are some basil seeds, many different varieties. Little fuzzy, but you can also take what's known as a cutting from an existing plant. Now this works better for some species than for others. This, for example, is a cutting that I took from a plant that I have. This is actually from a loofah plant. You know the loofah sponges you use in the bath? Those are actually gourds. They grow on vines. They grow on a vine plant. I've got it growing in the back. If there's enough time, I will show in a moment. So basically, this was getting a little long and unruly. So I took a pair of scissors and I cut it. When you do this, so you have your plant with my beautiful artwork here, and it's growing into whatever. And it's a lot of times it'll have little branches off and they'll have tiny leaves. So you don't want to cut it here for your cutting usually. You can, but a lot of times that'll be too narrow, too steep, whatever. You want to go for the newer growth. So if the stem, if you've figured out which one you want, and this is a zoomed in section of the stem, this goes towards the main body of the plant, this is just a bunch of leaves. You want to try and cut it at an angle, not straight perpendicular with it, but at a slight angle, diagonal. That will help it grow and help it absorb water easier. It'll have greater surface area along this cut. So you probably can't see it very well on this. But in any case, once you have your cutting, you can get a bottle of what's known as rooting powder, which is just hormone, or you can just stick it in water. Rooting hormone will help make it more likely it will grow roots, but not necessarily guaranteed. So basically, you'll just stick it in water. So I'm hoping that in a week or two, this will have roots, have started to sprout some roots, similar to the way this one did. So hydroponics, there's a couple. This is the most basic kind. It's a cup with water. It does not get more simple than that. You've probably seen someone who had like an avocado with sticks in it sitting on a cup of water. That's what this is. They're trying to sprout the seed. You can transplant hydroponic things into soil, and a lot of times they'll take well, which is why a lot of times these are used for starters. However, in the interest of time, I'm going to quickly show some of the hydroponic systems I have that are a little more complicated. So in a basic hydroponic system, you can just do the water. However, if you're looking for an active one, you add a pump into it, and the pump will push the water up to wherever the plant is and then trickle back down into the basin of water. So it ends up looking something like this. So tub of water goes up to the container with the plant. Water goes in, water drains back down. This is what's known as an ebb and flow system. There's another type where you just have the container of water and you have a raft on it that the plant just floats on. And then there's an air stone like you see in a fish aquarium that just bubbles up air. And the plant just floats on top of the water level. That's what's known as DWC, deep water current. So let's look at some actual fancier ones. That's how you would do a DIY system. I actually happen to have what are known as aero gardens. These are retail systems, and they come in different sizes. Air Garden is a brand. So these are cherry tomatoes. Now you'll notice that they are all sort of jammed in there. That goes back to the space thing. So they're crowding each other out a little bit because I actually went to the store and I bought some I bought some normal in the dirt cherry tomatoes because I have this much larger farm system here that the cloth is on. If you buy the Aero Garden brand or you are a little more careful, you can get ones that are smaller. However, since I had the space, I decided to run an experiment and make a little larger one. These are some peppers. If you're wondering about the bars, that is to keep my cats from eating them. Okay, and you can see some rosemary plants in there as well. So those rosemaries were actually ones that I got from the grocery store. So sometimes if you go to the grocery store, you'll see live herbs in the produce refrigerator section that actually have roots. You can just take those and you can plant them into the ground, or you can plant them into a hydroponic system. I recommend doing it quickly after you get them, because otherwise the roots could start to rot or go bad. Transplant shock is also a thing. So these are a couple of smaller AeroGarden systems. So there's two of them here. This one is full of a bunch of different kinds of herbs. So we've got some basil back here, we've got some thyme and mint, a few other things, and some lettuce there. Trying to get the angle here. So you can see that they have the light at the top. Those little icons are the status indicators, and inside, let me set the computer down so I can show, and inside here is actually a pump where you pour in the water and all the roots grow. So those white strings, those are actually the roots. You can actually see the shine from the water level there. Now, just going to very briefly glance at the loofah plant, and then I'm going to show the hallway farm. So this is a loofah plant. In probably a few months or so, it will hopefully be growing large gourds that will be loofah sponges. Now, remember when I was talking about support before? I've actually put an old lacy scarf type thing that I got from a thrift store here, because I'm going to use that as a makeshift trellis, because notice that this is nice and long and spindly. These little curlicues here, that's because this is a vine. These actually try to grow in and around things, and it pulls the plant up. It naturally tries to lift itself. However, since I've got it in this container without anything attached to it, it doesn't work. If I leave it like this, however, it will eventually start to attach itself. All right, one more garden really fast. So one of the main issues that I've had with trying to grow things indoor is actually pets. My cats apparently love salads. So we've actually had to do things such as attach a piece of plastic, put a piece of plexiglass on the front of the garden. So basically did this with a set of magnets, because the frame of this one is metal. However, you could also zip tie something to attach it, do other things. So these are some more pepper plants. Eventually they will need trellises like the others. However, at the moment they are fairly sturdy. However, going back to that crowding and light thing, they can easily be crowded out. This is a Thai hot pepper plant that my cats actually pulled out of the garden and ate, and we had to put back in. However, that provides a nice way to show how roots work. So we got our support, we got our plant, it's all good. On the other side, we have a burgeoning lettuce patch. Trying to get it in the shot, but this only goes so far back. All right, so lettuce is a little different. It doesn't mind the crowding quite so badly, although I apparently need to make a salad because this is pretty thin. These are just some chives in the front. Anyway, I think I've reached the point to where I'm ready for questions. Okay, any questions?
There are a few. Can you hear me? No, we may have to relay.
Since we are having some audiovisual, I don't think I see them. However, I'd like to thank everyone for listening. Oh, sorry, do have a question. Decompile ransomware strain. Decompiling would be RE. I can absolutely recommend some open source learning links for RE. Ping me in the Slack and I will start putting together a list from a workshop that I did a while back. Plant zones are not so important if growing indoors. Their environment is your environment or the one that you give them. Closer to a window is a little different because then it can be cooled or warmed from it. Resources for hydroponic systems, I can also totally do that. Again, hit me up in the Slack. Synaptic Rewrite. Thank you for your time. I hope everyone has a great day. Stay safe, wash your hands, stay sane.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you very much. I know that Morgan cannot hear me at this point in time, but we're very grateful for the presentation. Bear with us a minute and we will have to switch over to our next